quieting down the troops here.
Excuse me.
Dr. Miriam Diamond is our colleague. Miriam is our colleague from the Department of Earth Sciences and our colleague from the School of the Environment. Sorry, folks on Zoom, it's just a little noisy. And our colleague from the School of the Environment and the Department of Chemical Engineering and Applied Chemistry and the Dalla School of Public Health and the Department of Physical and Environmental Sciences at UTSC. Now, how's that for impressive list? But with her degrees in biology, zoology, mining engineering, and chemical engineering and applied chemistry, those multiple cross appointments really aren't too surprising. What also isn't surprising, therefore, is the multidisciplinary nature of her research program. She works with the Diamond Environmental Research Group here at U of T. She and her lab study chemical contaminants from emission to transport, indoors and outdoors, and on to human and ecological exposure. But it doesn't even stop there, because the team also works to find ways to manage and reduce those chemical contaminants. Miriam herself has been an active, and I must say very successful, promoter of sound chemical management at the international as well as the national level. She's the co-chair of the, and these are always hard for me to say, this is a mouthful, the Canadian Chemicals Management Plan Science Committee, I did it, and the vice chair of the International Panel on Chemical Pollution. She's a member of the Scientific and Technology Advisory Panel of the Global Environmental Faculty, and she sits on the board of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Named the Canadian Environmental Scientist of the Year in 2007 by the Canadian Geographical Society, Miriam is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and associate editor of the journal Environmental Science and Technology, which is a leading journal in the field. Her advocacy and her scientific work are both theoretical and practical. I say this because she was co-chair of the Ontario Ministry of the Environment's Toxic Reduction Scientific Expert Panel that advised the minister on the Toxic Reduction Act that was proclaimed in 2009. More recently, the Guardian newspaper reported just last year on her study that concluded that chemical pollution had crossed what was called a planetary boundary. In other words, the point at which human-made changes to the Earth push it outside the stable environment of the last 10,000 years. So it's clearly about time for us all to hear from her on her topic today. And her topic is solutions and why we need them now to address the global threat of chemical pollution. Please welcome Miriam Diamond.
Linda, thank you. That was such a very warm and generous welcome. Daphne, thank you very much. And also for your forbearance with the technical problems. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I'm going to move this down. Being of the shorter variety, I just want to make sure I can see over the podium. So thank you very much. I actually would like to know, you've heard about me. I'd actually like to know a bit about you. How many of you, I know one of you. Yes. How many of you are in the sciences? As in, okay. Social science? And humanities? Thank you. That's very helpful. Okay. So hopefully my pitch is okay and will reach everybody, because it's always a challenge in an interdisciplinary room. So I advance by pressing.
Sometimes the first time it makes you do this thing. Down in the corner, right there. And now these should work from now on. If they don't, go there.
Well, I'd like to start and finish on an emotional note, because we need the energy to keep going. Even though we're all older, and we still need the energy to keep going to solve really important problems. So I'm going to start with a quote from Barack Obama, which I find to be very inspirational. Hope is that stubborn thing inside us that insists, despite all the evidence to the contrary, that something better awaits us if we have the courage to reach for it and to work for it and to fight for it. And my goal today is to inspire all of us to keep fighting for working for a better world. I mean, that is all I want to accomplish today. Well, not a small feat. So I turn to somebody who's inspired me over years. I think he's probably Thomas Homer Dixon, I think is one of the most cogent thinkers on the state of the world from that incorporates where we're at through the physical science underpinnings to where we need to go. In his book, Commanding Hope, from a couple of years ago, he talked about the importance of hope, agency, that's our ability to act and to have a vision. So what he speaks to is the hope too. It's an active emotion to move us from an old vision in which society is stuck in now of a current perilous condition to renew the future, to a better future. We live today in such a horribly polarized society. It's so terribly polarized. And yet, if we are to seek meaningful solutions, we need to have some type of shared identity that we can all buy into across that polarized scale. What he identifies are those shared attributes. Is it that what everybody can buy into is opportunity, safety. So that's opportunity for all. We're at the end of our careers, but we want opportunity for our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren to be able to choose the lives that they want, to have the same opportunities that we've had. Safety, safety for all, safety in terms of your health, your personal well-being, and a sense of justice, that each one of us will be seen for who we are and will be able to be seen amongst our peers for justice. So, having set the stage, here's what I want to talk about today. I want to make the proposition that we're exceeding the planetary boundary for chemicals, and I'll describe what the planetary boundary is, which is a situation in terms of global biogeochemical systems that keeps the Earth operating such that we have our complex society today that delivers healthcare, that delivers education, that allows us to be safe in this room and online. I'm going to talk about PCBs as a case study. PCBs are polychlorinated biphenyls, which is each one of us has PCBs in our body. I'll be talking about them. I will use the framework of lock-in to describe how we can be moving forward, which is part of solutions. So the roadmap starts on this road. It's along the Cabot Trail in Cape Breton that I drove along this past summer, and I think most of you know where Cape Breton is. How many of you have been to the Cabot Trail? Oh, yeah. Okay. So you know how fabulous it is, especially if it's not raining and you can see the vista. And if not, you've got to have a great imagination to know what it looks like beyond the mist. Okay. So we are exceeding the planetary boundary for chemicals. So I've been working with within UNEP. UNEP is the United Nations Environment Program. It's one of the many arms of the whole umbrella under the United Nations. And several years ago, under UNEP, a series of reports were released, as UNEP does, as a watchdog of the world, to say that we now face a triple threat. Number one is climate change. The 15°C temperature this afternoon with up to 90 km/h winds is for me, a frightening reminder that we're experiencing climate change right now, today, this afternoon. Number two, loss of biodiversity, the perilous loss of many, many species. And the third part of the triple threat, which was just recently recognized, is that of global chemical pollution. The quote here from Fernando Coimbra, chair of the Committee of Permanent Representatives, was the toxic trail of economic growth, pollution, and waste, which results every year in the premature deaths of millions of people across the world. So that's the triple planetary threat. So under that, with that backdrop, a group of us labored over 2 years to discuss the planetary boundary for chemical pollution. And we published this paper last year. So let me tell you what the planetary boundary is. There are 9 of them. They originate from work done by Johannes Rockström. Which country is he from? You're only allowed one question. Sweden. Of course, Sweden. Johannes Rockström and colleagues introduced the concept of the planetary boundary in 2009. So what the planetary boundary is, you've probably seen the Plimsoll line. You've been up to a ship and you've seen that weird configuration over here. Okay, I see a number of you are nodding that you've seen this. So the Plimsoll line indicates the maximum level of loading for a ship. So if it goes above the Plimsoll line, in other words, if the ship is too loaded down, the ship can just tip over. In other words, it's exceeded its safe operating limit. It's got to be loaded less than what the Plimsoll line indicates. Small point here. It did take about 1,000 years for humanity generally to adopt this Plimsoll line. It was first used by the Greeks in previous millennia, and it took a while for humanity to catch up in the 1870s with painting ships with the Plimsoll line. Anyways, it's an indication that you're operating within a safe limit of that vessel. So in the same way, the planetary boundary is an indication that we're operating within the safe limit of what the world looks like. So when I say the safe limit, what I mean is that society is positioned on a very thin edge of stable environmental conditions. It's society that is positioned there. The world is going to go on regardless of climate change and loss of biodiversity. But our prosperous society will not, because of the costs of going outside of this very stable situation of the operating conditions. So here's what I mean. When the winds rise to very high velocities, today they're predicted to go up to 80 km/h, which could cause signs to blow down. It could cause somebody to be killed as a result of falling trees and debris. So that's what I mean about the safe operating space. When all of us were kids growing up, we didn't have such high winds. When the winds get really high, they're going to knock over power lines. People are going to lose power. And you know that if some people lose power, they may also lose their lives. So what I mean is that society is poised on this very thin ledge of a stable environment so that all our systems keep functioning. Okay, so there are some planetary boundaries that have a very sharp transition. For example, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The concern is that when carbon dioxide gets too high, I think we're at 450 parts per million carbon dioxide. Due to complex biogeochemical processes, for example, the Earth's, the climate is going to tip quickly to a condition in which our current society can't function. And we're seeing this with hurricanes and typhoons and so on, right? New Zealand, isn't it about a third of the people in New Zealand now are under a typhoon watch? So that's what I mean. So it's a tipping point. One of the, anyway, I don't want to talk too much. So for climate, it's seen as a tipping point. Then there are other planetary boundaries. So there's climate change, ocean acidification, stratospheric ozone depletion. I won't, nutrients, having too many nutrients, not having enough fresh water, change in land use, that's land use degradation, loss of biodiversity, and aerosols. And here's chemical pollution, which is not a tipping point. It's just sort of the frog in the water where the temperature is slowly going up. And I don't want to keep going on that analogy because I do like frogs. But it's a slow slide into outside of the safe operating space. It's as opposed to a tipping point. So why did we decide last year that we're exceeding the planetary boundary for chemical pollution? There's already concern about exceeding the planetary boundary, as you could see here, for nitrogen, for example, for loss of biodiversity. Why did we decide? Well, it's a very difficult problem, but we decided because of what we believe is an overwhelming weight of evidence of harm. It's not a single piece of information or two, it's a body of information. And the reason why we decided that is because the rate of increase in the number in chemical production, the total mass of chemicals being produced, the number of chemicals being produced, dramatically exceeds the rate at which we can assess them for their safety. And far more dramatically exceeds the rate at which we can control them. That's why we decided now. The rates of chemical production have tripled from about 2000, from 1950 to now. They've gone up, as you can see, about 80% from 2000. So that, and this is total chemical production. This is a graph that shows relative rates of chemical production of a whole series of different chemicals. The rate of increase in chemical production far exceeds the rate at which you lose nouns as you get older, don't you? The rate at which the population is growing. So the rate of chemical production is far greater than the rate at which we're adding more people to the world. There are about 350,000 substances registered for use globally. 70,000 have been registered in the previous decade, 70,000. And of the total 350,000, 30,000 are registered in emerging economies. So emergent or developing economies, I don't know if you've noticed, but we've largely deindustrialized in North America. Most chemical production has moved offshore. Asia is a powerhouse of chemical production, India, China. Some of the countries in which chemical production, actually many of the countries in which chemical production occurs don't have the capacity for oversight. I'm not so sure developed countries do either. So I'm not standing on high ground here. 50,000 of those are confidential, covered under confidential business information, so we don't even know what they are, which means as an environmental chemist, I can't go out and analyze it because I don't know what I'm looking for. 70,000 have an ambiguous structure. So again, as an environmental chemist, I don't even know what I'm looking for. Like if we were to look at for one of these chemicals in your blood, we wouldn't know what we're looking for. 10,000 substances are used in plastics, and of those 2,400 are of concern. So what I mean by showing you these large numbers is to reinforce the opinion, and it is an opinion, that we're beyond the safe operating space because we cannot track all of what's going on. It's too complicated, too much. We don't have the capacity. Oh, right. Sorry, one last animation. Under the European Union REACH stands, I don't remember what REACH stands for, but it's the legislation passed by the European Union that covers chemical substances. 23,000 substances have been registered, right, out of the 350 total substances worldwide. 80% have yet to be assessed. 80%. Yikes. Okay. So 2 weeks ago, I was in Bangkok for a United Nations Environment Program meeting, and I thought I would take the day off after the meeting ended, in which I went to the day market, which is absolutely enormous. Has anybody been to Bangkok? Have you been to the day market? So it's just like a crazy complicated, it's just enormous. So a lot of people see lots of fun stuff. What I saw was, sadly, and have you traveled worldwide like 30, 40 years ago? So 30, 40 years ago, you would go to the Bangkok market, and it was actually silk and wood and natural materials. Everything was synthetic, including the 100% cashmere scarves they're absolutely synthetic. I went to one of the stalls that had bowls. They were, it looked like a wood composite plastic. Everything looked like junk. So, what does it look like to exceed the planetary boundary? I can talk to you about numbers of chemicals, and it may not resonate. But for me, what resonated was walking through this enormous bazaar with an incredible amount of junk, because ultimately it was largely junk that's not durable. And then to see the waste management issues that confront Thailand, which are absolutely crazy, and to talk to people who are involved in trying to protect the Thai environment from junk and waste and hazardous waste amongst all odds. They were so inspiring to me. To me, this is a very visceral sign of passing the planetary boundary. Here's another sign, and that is these are along the axis here. We have countries starting with Ukraine, Italy, Czech Republic, going down, here's Finland, and going down to Kenya. These are concentrations. It's a concentration scale along here, going from a low concentration to a high concentration of PCBs in blood. And the dotted line here, the pink line, is the safe level. So what this shows is that it's not just the visceral sign of all the waste, but it's that I don't know if all of us carry such high levels of PCBs, because we were born, well, I don't know. I was born in 1955, and maybe I do have actually quite a high PCB load. I'm not going to guess when you were born, but yes. My mom didn't carry PCBs because she was born in 1919, before PCBs were rampant. I was a PCB baby, so to speak, because PCBs were in the environment, and I passed it on to my kids. So yes, so PCBs often exceed the health-based limits because of their global distribution, and they are so persistent. So I'm going to go more quickly now because I see I'm taking too long to speak. What are PCBs? So everybody knows what an electrical transformer looks like, right? So before World War II, electrical transformers had mineral oil in them, and mineral oil is it's used as to insulate so that the electrical transmissions can be made from low to high voltage and back and forth. But the problem with mineral oils is that if they're a spark, mineral oils will burn. So the mineral oils were useful in expanding electrical systems, but they were unsafe because they were explosions and fires. The engineering answer to that was to add chlorine to essentially to an oil, which stabilizes it, reduces its flammability. But so it makes it safer, right? Because it's not going to blow up. But what it does, it makes it the molecule very persistent and bioaccumulative. So by bioaccumulative, I mean that when you and I eat PCBs, and we do eat them because they're throughout our food supply, it goes into us and stays in us. We don't metabolize and excrete them. To the extent where PCBs now threaten some of the orca populations on the west coast off of British Columbia. Crazy. So PCBs, like, why are we still talking about them? The Stockholm Convention was was ratified in 2004 with 185 parties to control chemicals like PCBs. PCBs are like the poster child of a persistent organic pollutant. And this is the timeline of Stockholm. Like, it started way before 2001. Canada was very influential because of the accumulative nature of PCBs. You have the perverse situation of Inuit in the far north not having many electrical transformers in communities, and yet eating PCBs through the whales and seals, country foods. Wrong, like so wrong. Okay, so the timeline, what I want to point out is that by, here we are coming up to 2025. So all in-use PCBs should be phased out from the world. And by 2028, they should be environmentally sound management. We should get rid of them. Okay, so how are we doing? There's mostly a ban on production. There's still some concern that North Korea is producing them. Well, North Korea is producing nuclear warheads. There are a whole bunch of problems going on with North Korea. This is probably one of the lesser problems. So there's generally, so mostly a ban on production. Phase out of use, we're not doing so well. Ensure environmentally sound management by 2028, not doing so well. So here's an example of what environmentally sound management means. The picture down here is of an electrical transformer. It's in Mexico with PCB oils in it. And what happens is, unfortunately, is that over time, even though it's a sealed transformer, the PCBs leak out over time. This is a project funded by the Global Environment Facility. The PCB oils are removed, taken to France for destruction because there aren't facilities in Mexico for environmentally sound destruction. Okay, so PCBs were used mostly in capacitors and transformers and dielectric fluids, but because they were such a successful molecule, they were used as plasticizers in a whole bunch of stuff. I'll show you in a moment. Flexible sealants, they were used in durable paints, surface coatings, used as flame retardants, pesticide extenders, carbonless duplicating paper. Oh my God. Here's a good one. I have no idea why PCBs were used in Fabulon hardwood floor finish, but if your home was unfortunately coated with Fabulon hardwood floor finish, you would have PCBs in your house forever. Book bindings. So this one came out a couple of years ago. Like, really? Because they were used as an adhesive and a flexible sealant that was very durable. They were used in the back coating of book bindings, so that in some, like, libraries now have PCB problems. Oh my God. They're also used in some paint pigments and kitchen cabinets. My house, I live just west of here. My house is over 100 years old. It has PCBs in it. We figure because the windows were recaulked, and there must have been PCBs in the caulking, or maybe it was a carbonless copy paper. I don't know, but my house has PCBs in it. That's what happens when you're an environmental chemist. You get to study your own house. Okay, so here we have the amount of PCBs that were actually produced. It's this low line at the bottom, starting in the 1930s, and we're going up to 1995. And here's the PCB mass going from 5 million tons up to 20,000 tons. So not that many PCBs in relative terms were produced, but because they were mixed with mineral oils, and they were mixed with other things like book bindings, the total mass of PCB contaminated material is a lot. It's many-fold. It's over 15,000 tons worldwide, and not even to mention the PCBs that have escaped. And then here's the timeline. So we have to get from having over 15 million tons, sorry, that's million, 15 million tons of PCB contaminated material down to 0. So I'm going to show you the lessons learned from 3 countries, which I hope you will find interesting. Any questions so far? Comments? No, we're good? Good, okay. So here are 3 countries. Well, Toronto isn't a country. I know some of us would like it to be, but it's not. So we have Toronto in the red, the Czech Republic or Czechia in yellow, and the US in blue. The reason why we're looking at Toronto here is because we did a very detailed analysis for Toronto. We were not, I'll tell you the story. So I had this grad student who worked for Environment Canada, and this was back in, I don't know, like 15 years ago or something, or yeah. And he said, oh, well, I know, I like, we've got the PCB data, I'll just give it to you. So he gave it to us. And then we published it. And then I bet you can guess what happened. Environment Canada got really upset and said, no more data is being given out. It's kept secret. It's under lock and key. You're not getting any more. So that's why we focused on Toronto, because we had those data. We were given Ontario data subsequent to that. They were far less juicy and entertaining. But anyway, you'll see the Toronto data in a moment. Okay, anyways, this is the number of PCB contaminated items, and we're comparing from 2005 to about 2018. Toronto's gotten rid of just about all of our PCB contaminated items. The US has got rid of some, and the Czech Republic has also gotten rid of some. But what we really see is that Toronto in particular has done a fantastic job at actually eliminating the mass of PCBs. So this is the number of contaminated items, but Toronto has, like, we're almost down to 0 here with the actual mass of PCBs. I'm going to tell you why the number went up in the Czech Republic. I'll tell you that in a moment. And oh man, pretty stable in the US, like not changed much. And then this is the mass of pure PCBs. So this is like PCB contaminated stuff, mineral oils, soil, garbage, and so on. This is the mass of pure PCBs. And here we see that both Toronto and the Czech Republic have done really well. Oh dear, the US has not. Okay, so let's look at Toronto. Or really, it was supposed to be our case study of Canada. So we have, as good Canadians, we have never manufactured PCBs. We relied on the US to do the manufacturing. We imported 40,000 tons. The PCBs were used in anything that requires a lot of electricity, essentially, like aside from the carbonless copy paper, anything that requires a lot of electricity. We're, however, the second highest per capita user of PCBs. So here's a map. These were the data that grad student spirited out of Environment Canada. We're down here, right at the U of T campus. And the red dots indicate the amount of PCB that was in use. This is in 2006. So I'm just going to draw your attention. This is Bloor Street, right? Yonge Street. Okay. Time for audience participation. Where do you think the PCBs were? Do you see this cluster right down here? Bay Street. What do you think is going on there? Any guess? Think of buildings that require a lot of electricity. Financial. It's just that the towers were huge. Lots of electricity going to the financial towers. It's not that that's heavy industry in Toronto, right? It's the banking business. So it's that each building had a transformer on its roof with a lot of PCBs in it. Okay, next question. What's along here? Bloor Street. Exactly. TTC. These are the TTC stops here. Okay. All right. Let me see. Little tiny dots all over the place. Transformers, schools, hospitals, anything that required electricity. So so we actually had a lot of fun when we saw this map. So you guessed it. So these are the buildings, right? Because each building has so many people, at least pre-pandemic, who were working in the building, there was just tremendous electricity requirements. Sid Smith. Anybody taught in Sid Smith? PCB building. We don't exactly know where. We think it's in the building caulking because we surreptitiously, this is the royal we, right? The students surreptitiously went around and scraped a little bit of the caulking off, and we analyzed it and got a high PCB hit. Wahlberg is another building, chemical engineering on College Street, PCB building. This is a school I went to. It's at Bathurst and around Bathurst and Wilson. I don't know for sure, but to me, this looks like it probably had PCBs in the transformer in the basement. Okay, so in 1977, Canada passed legislation to stop new uses, to track PCBs. And in 2008, the legislation was updated to eliminate, to come in compliance with the Stockholm Convention, to get rid of the PCBs. And we have done so. But I want to tell you why. Because back then in the 70s, there was a lot of political will and interest in environmental protection. We had a newly minted Environment Canada. We had a newly minted Ministry of the Environment. We had a lot of progress going on. We had very good record keeping. We spent money on compliance monitoring. We tracked what was going on. And that's why we've been successful. Now, let's contrast that with the US. So the US was the world's largest producer and consumer, over 500,000 tons, and the largest per capita consumer. That probably makes complete sense, right? Just think of how intensely industrialized the US has been. But so different in terms of legislation. So legislation was passed in 1979 to stop new manufacturing, distribution, and new uses. But the US is not party to the Stockholm Convention. The US is not party to most international agreements. There is no federal US legislation demanding movement on PCBs. So they're still in use. and the stocks are a mess. There's certainly some removal, but record keeping is so poor that it's really hard to figure out what PCBs are there and what's not. There are all these Superfund sites, like very highly industrialized sites that are really a mess. And on top of that, as you know, the US has very large military sites that the military extensively use PCBs, both in Canada and the US. Canada, the legislation exempted the military because, well, we're not going there. So the other thing we found out about the US is that the US, some of the management of PCBs is not safe. They're being dumped in landfills. So, and a landfill isn't safe because the PCBs can go into the groundwater and they're volatile. They go up into the air. So they're not being managed. So we found that about half of the PCB stock has been landfilled. Crazy. So they're not on track for meeting Stockholm. They're not part of Stockholm anyways. No legislative timetable. It's just not on the agenda. And if they were, it would probably be tied up in courts, right? Because you know that the legal profession does very well in the States, and there's very limited enforcement or compliance. This is a map showing where the PCBs are. Not surprisingly, it's, you know, older industrial locations and military sites. But what affects us are all the sites along the Great Lakes. Yep. Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, and this is the Niagara River. A lot of, well, transformers at the Niagara, of course. Okay, the last case study is the Czech Republic. So before the Czech Republic split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, Czechoslovakia produced, when it was part of the Eastern Bloc, produced 21,481 tons of PCBs, but only used half of that, right? The other half was exported to heavy industry, presumably within the Soviet bloc. And what was it used for? This is so perverse. Some of the PCBs were used in paints, including paints that were used on the troughs from which cows drank water. The PCBs went into the water, went into the cows, and that's one of the reasons why, and I think that's the next slide, the Czech Republic. So these are, yes, in blood. The Czech Republic is third. No, these aren't in blood. I think this is in breast milk. Excuse me, breast milk. Czech Republic, third highest levels, laced throughout the dairies, cheese, milk, cream. Yeah. Even though the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia was 20th percent in terms of per capita use, but it was the critical use in that food production chain. So in 1984, when did the Berlin Wall drop? Was it 1984? 89. Okay, so the Czech Republic stopped production of PCBs in 84 because the Czech Republic really wanted to join the European Union. And the European Union had very strict legislation on PCBs. To get into the European Union, the Czech Republic started tracking, continued to track and to try to get rid of their PCB stock. And what they found after the fall of communism, so communism, the PCBs were tracked, very good state records, right? Because the communist regime had good state records. Communist regime stopped, transition period, the records, a whole bunch of the records got lost. They went from state-owned facilities with good record keeping to who knew who owned it and the records got lost. And that's why the inventory seemingly went up. It's because the records were found over time. It's not that the PCBs went up, it's that the records went up. But it's what we should be thinking of is how our governance allows us to track these hazardous chemicals and not to track hazardous chemicals. Okay, so hopefully the Czech Republic will meet its obligations, but it will require a lot of money. The Czech Republic has very good record, very high state capacity, good record keeping, and it's the importance of keeping within the EU legislation. And now let's turn to the global situation. So globally, this top map, red indicates the greatest use of PCBs here. Oranges were second. You can see the Russia is second. And you can see that this was done in the early 2000s. You see no PCB, seemingly no PCB use in Africa. These estimates were made according to GDP. Now let's look at the bottom figure, which is the parties to the Stockholm Convention, 184, and with various rates of compliance with Stockholm. So the dark green, say from Finland and Australia and France, means that you've just about destroyed all your PCBs using environmentally sound management. Green is pretty close. And then the red countries ratified Stockholm, but haven't even been able to file any documents with Stockholm. Libya, of course, under terrible political situation. Somalia. I would not make any excuses for Saudi Arabia. And here's Uzbekistan. And then the countries in orange have a national implementation plan, but they couldn't track the whole inventory. And then we go to, various levels of compliance. So only 13% of all the Stockholm signatories are on their way to achieving the goal of environmentally sound management. 18% are on their way. 5% have no national implementation plan, couldn't even file it. 42% partial or preliminary inventory, as in I don't know where my PCBs are. 13% have completed an inventory, but don't have any capacity to get rid of them. So it's an inequitable burden. Rich versus poor countries, really. We have seen the benefits of PCBs through enabling electricity transmission systems and a high level of industry. But some of our countries, I don't know if Canada has or not, I think not, but some countries have achieved their management by shipping PCBs to poor countries. Yeah. And we know that just from some sampling that was done off the coast of Africa. And here's, for example, we read several very upsetting stories in these national implementation plans. Ghana, PCB oils were used to produce beauty creams and to lubricate sewing machines. So if it's a beauty cream and it goes right on your face, that's providing an excellent opportunity for exposure. So can we clean up PCBs? So what has been accomplished is that we've spent globally $500 million to eliminate 88,000 tons. This is so expensive. The cost varies from cheapest in Asia to environmentally sound management, 3,000 a ton, to most expensive in Africa. I don't want to go through all these numbers. Just the total cost of cleanup would be $2.4 billion. Like, who has $2.4 billion just on this one chemical? And I'm involved now with the Global Environment Facility. It's a World Bank fund that collects money from donor countries through the World Bank. Canada donates some money that's where the this money has come from, but there's a funding gap of $1.7 billion. Okay, so here's the lesson. We can't even clean up one group of chemicals. And yet we're busy producing more hazardous chemicals. We can't, so the lesson is that this one group of chemicals, unequivocal harm, deeply enmeshed in the technosphere and tied to GDP. So why can't we get rid of chemicals? So last year, we also published a paper by a very talented undergrad, Jonathan Blumenthal, that talked about lock-in. So like, why can't we get rid of really hazardous chemicals? Why can't we move away from our existing systems? Here we see environmental and health costs are mounting, and yet we keep producing and consuming these chemicals. Why can't we move out of this system? So we use this idea of lock-in, which comes from the fossil fuels. Why, given such unequivocal evidence of climate change, why are we so slow at getting rid of fossil fuels from our economy? And because it's complex, because we're locked in to their use. Economically, we're locked in. We have the infrastructure to use both fossil fuels and transformers with PCBs. The equipment, the corporate organization, jobs. We have social behaviors that are locked into using many of these chemicals. The technologies and the processes are locked in and keep the status quo going. And finally, for politically, we have infrastructure, like a political bureaucracy that maintains use, and we just can't move fast enough. We have strong lobbying against movement away from some hazardous chemicals and fossil fuels, very strong lobbying, despite evidence of unequivocal harm. I'm going to skip this one because I see what the time is. I'm going to move forward towards solutions. So given this complexity, what do? We need to broaden the scope of regulations. One reason why we have a failure of regulations is because we may be regulating demand over here, but not supply. So we may be trying, for example, to reduce, we reduced the use of, for example, we eliminated the use of PCBs. We brought in alternative chemicals, some of which are also harmful. We actually don't have good solutions, but what our regulations do is say, we're just going to get rid of this chemical without looking at the whole problem of what's it used for? What is the replacement going to be? Is the replacement really safe? Should we be shifting the technology totally? We don't do that. We just go, get rid of that one chemical. Do you remember the bisphenol A out of the baby bottles? Do you remember that one? So that was fascinating. And if you want, we could talk about that because I was actually there on the front lines of that one. The regulation didn't look at the replacements and did not ask about the replacements. And we know that some of the other bisphenols, S and AD and so on, are also harmful and that went in to replace bisphenol A. Prime example. Or we got rid of some forever chemicals. We got rid of a few of the forever chemicals in Scotchgard and in Teflon. Did we ask what was going to replace them? No. We just turned off. We said, you shall not use these anymore, but it's out of scope to look at the replacements. And yes, are the replacements problematic? Yes, they're problematic. We need more comprehensive regulations. Ask me if I think that's going to happen, and I'm going to say no. And that's why you're here, because we need to engage all stakeholders early. And that means the public, and that means you, and that means me, because we need to get everybody engaged to try to affect these transitions. We need economic supports, for example, of individuals and industries making chemicals that are hazardous. We have to transition away from those industries. And what we really need is imagination and long-term proactive thinking to prevent us from locking in to these new to new problems with hazardous chemicals. Okay, so we thought of some solutions. So let's consider a chemical, starting with, most of these are petroleum-based chemicals. So we have the petroleum extraction here, manufacture them, use it in a product. Eventually it gets dumped, goes into the environment, and so on. So we have an impact pathway starting from the extraction and production of the chemical all the way to the final impact. And here we're mainly in the technological domain, and here we're mainly in the environmental domain. And many of our regulations say, well, thou shalt not have more than X amount of chemical in your drinking water, which doesn't address the upstream problem of production, right? It's addressing it here, which is not, in my mind, efficient, because already heavy investment has been made in extraction and production over here. So to simply say over here, you're too high, means, wow, that's complicated to get back down to here to turn the tap off. Maybe we should just be turning the tap off like right here at the beginning. So we have production uses and volumes, the amount of these nasty chemicals in the environment, and then the final Earth system's effects. And we can intervene all along here. As I say, many of our, we have environmental regulations on safe limits for actually a small group of, it's quite a small group of chemicals, because as I said, we can't keep up with the proliferation of chemicals. So even having limits on, we have quite a modest number of drinking water limits. Thank you for having them, but a modest number. We could have improved waste management, but to me, it's most efficient to actually get down here and put a cap on chemical production right at the get-go. Because to me, the root of the problem is this unrestrained, unsustainable growth in the production of chemicals. Now, is this going to happen? So we have a number of multilateral environmental agreements, such as I talked about the Stockholm Convention, and we saw that I'm a great supporter of the Stockholm Convention, but we saw the difficulties of just tackling one chemical. Subsequent chemicals that have been listed have been watered down with exemptions, because countries have said, we can't comply. Give us an exemption for this and this and this. So that means that even under Stockholm, there's less ability to really strictly adhere to getting rid of hazardous chemicals. The Global Plastics Treaty, the first negotiations, it's being negotiated right now. The negotiations started in Uruguay in November. It's a poorly defined process, and the petrochemical industry is in hard lobbying for managing plastic waste and not turning off the tap of plastic production. And I can tell you, we're not going to solve the plastic problem by waste management. You've got to turn off the tap, and it's very upsetting to many of us that the industry is so deeply involved in the negotiation of the treaty. So I was in Bangkok for the first face-to-face meeting of a new intergovernmental science policy panels on chemical waste and pollution prevention, which I think is really exciting. It's like an IPCC, you know, an international panel on climate change, but for chemicals and waste. All the countries many countries were represented. Canada was there at the table. I was involved in one of the discussions. This is Sir Robert Watson, who set up the IPCC and who set up actually the panel IBES for biodiversity. That's me looking down at my notes. And it was extremely heartening that the government delegates came with a sense of purpose and got a statement on the objective and functions of the panel. It was really encouraging. I was really encouraged. There was some talk that on Friday afternoon that Russia might come in and torpedo everything, just like for political reasons. And Iran had done that in the Minamata Convention because Iran can't get any global funds for cleanup because of sanctions. So, you know, it's really understandable. And I won't go into the geopolitics, but suffice it to say that around the table, certain government players can torpedo discussions for reasons not related to the topic per se. Anyways, nobody did that. It was great. All the representatives were moving forward. There were differences. The African nations wanted a lot of money, a lot of interest in capacity building because they don't have capacity, whereas the wealthy countries didn't want much said on that in the agreement. But anyway, it's moving forward. But it'll be a hard sell in this polarized world. It'll be a hard sell to talk about meaningful changes to reducing the use and distribution and production of hazardous chemicals, but I'm not giving up. So to end with Thomas Homer Dixon, a commanding hope that's honest about the dangers ahead and astute about the strategies we should use to face those dangers, and one that powerfully motivates us. Let's not aim for what's merely feasible and falsely hope that it will be enough. With commanding hope, let's aim for what we'd all consider enough, a future in which our children and life on this planet can flourish. And with that, I'd like to acknowledge a whole bunch of people who support all of this. Thanks.